The night sky over northern Italy wasn't quiet. It vibrated, low, distant, like the growl of something alive and angry moving through the clouds. Radar operators at a Luftwaffe listening post rubbed their eyes, stared at the green sweep of the scope, and leaned closer. A single blip had appeared out of nowhere. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what happened next. The blip jumped, an impossible leap, covering distance faster than any aircraft they'd ever tracked. One officer muttered, "Radar glitch." Another whispered, "No, that thing is moving." 12,000 feet above them, Lieutenant Nathan Reeves felt the prototype jet buck under him like a wild horse trying to throw its rider. He tightened his grip on the stick. The cockpit rattled violently, the frame groaning under speeds it had never been tested for. Wind screamed against the canopy with a pitch that made his eardrums ache. Reeves glanced at the airspeed indicator and blinked twice. The needle was buried so far past the red line that it was nearly horizontal. He exhaled a shaking breath and whispered, "Hale, what the hell did you do to this thing?" On the ground, miles away at a dimly lit U.S. forward test strip, Sergeant Marcus Hale sat on an overturned fuel drum, staring at the empty patch of sky where the prototype had vanished minutes earlier. The crew had gone silent when Reeves took off. They all knew the aircraft wasn't ready, at least not by regulation. Hale had been warned, threatened, even pulled off the maintenance roster. But he ignored every order and finished the modification anyway. Now he sat alone in the cold, jaw clenched, wondering if he'd just sent a man to his death. Inside the German radar station, tension escalated. One operator recalibrated his scope in disbelief. "It's accelerating," he said. "A jet?" his commander asked. "Jets don't move that fast." Another blip appeared. German interceptors launching to investigate. Within seconds, the pursuing dots fell behind on the screen. The mystery aircraft was pulling away like they were standing still. The commander stepped back from the radar, pale. "Get me Berlin," he said. "Now." Meanwhile, Reeves fought to keep control. The modified engine wasn't just powerful. It was alive, surging with a ferocity no blueprint had predicted. Each throttle push slammed him back into the seat, each burst of speed threatening to tear the wings from the fuselage. But there was something else, too. A thrilling, terrifying clarity that the jet wasn't struggling. It was hungry. It wanted more air, more sky, more speed. Reeves steadied his breathing, lowered the nose slightly, and let the engine off its leash. The sky blurred into a dark smear as the plane rocketed forward. The altimeter climbed. The horizon bent. Reeves could barely hear himself over the roar when he whispered the number he saw on the gauge. 710. Back on the ground, Sergeant Hale closed his eyes. He didn't know the number, not yet. But he felt it, felt the sky shake, felt the ground hum beneath his boots, felt the monstrous thing he had built tearing a hole through the night. And for the first time, the man who broke every rule allowed himself a smile. "Looks like she lived." Sergeant Marcus Hale never looked like a genius. He didn't act like one, didn't talk like one, and certainly didn't dress like one. Grease was his cologne. Motor oil stained his fingertips permanently black, and his uniform always seemed one loose thread away from falling apart. Most mechanics carried toolkits. Hale carried a coffee tin stuffed with mismatched bolts, clipped wires, and scrap metal he insisted was future history. To the officers, he was a problem. To the pilots, he was a miracle worker. To the military bureaucracy, he was an administrative nightmare with a wrench. Before the war, Hale had been a junkyard engineer in Kansas, one of those oddballs who built functioning tractors out of car carcasses and farm scraps. He dropped out of school at 15 but could diagnose a carburetor by smell. When he enlisted, the U.S. Army Air Forces expected a standard grease monkey. What they got was a restless innovator who couldn't stand inefficiency and despised the phrase, "that's not in the manual." By 1944, his reputation had spread across 3 squadrons. Pilots swapped stories. Jets he tuned ran smoother, piston engines he rebuilt pulled harder, and planes declared dead often rolled out of his hangar roaring like new beasts. He had a knack for reverse engineering German components from wreckage. He even figured out how to restore a damaged supercharger using pieces from a motorcycle carburetor. But every miracle had its price. Hale's modifications were never authorized. Almost all of them broke at least 1 regulation, and sometimes 5. When the brass caught him rerouting an ignition system with stripped copper wire scavenged from a lamp, he nearly ended up in front of a court-martial panel. When he drilled cooling vents into a P-47 cowling without paperwork, his commanding officer threw a folder at him and shouted, "You are not an engineer. You are a hazard." Hale's answer? "Sir, hazard is what keeps these boys alive." He didn't mean it disrespectfully. He meant it literally. The front line left no room for textbook purity. Engines overheated, fuel boiled, pistons seized. If a mechanic followed the manual word for word, planes died, and pilots died with them. Hale believed improvisation wasn't optional. It was survival. The problem was that his latest obsession wasn't a piston fighter. It was the squadron's experimental turbojet test bed, a prototype airframe assigned for data gathering only, absolutely not for combat, and strictly forbidden from unauthorized modifications. It was delicate, political, expensive, and surrounded by more paperwork than a bank vault. Naturally, Hale took one look at the engine, frowned, and said, "This thing's suffocating." Within 48 hours, he'd torn apart half the intake system, redesigned the airflow channels using scrap aluminum, enlarged the compressor inlet, and, most controversially, fitted a set of precision-machined bolts he'd forged himself in a crude field lathe. He didn't record any of this in the maintenance log. He didn't ask permission. He simply made the aircraft faster than the men in suits ever intended. When the officers found out, they froze the aircraft and threatened disciplinary action. Hale shrugged and returned to his workbench. Then Lieutenant Reeves volunteered to take it up. And everything, Hale's career, Reeves's life, and the war, hung in the balance. Lieutenant Jonah Reeves was the kind of pilot commanders loved on paper and feared in real life. He was disciplined, brilliant in the cockpit, and absolutely incapable of resisting a dare. So the moment he heard Hale mutter, "She'll run like a bat out of hell now," Reeves didn't wait for permission. He didn't even wait for the ground crew to finish arguing about chain of command. He simply tightened his harness, slid into the experimental jet, and yelled, "Open the hangar! If it blows up, I want everyone to see it." Technically, the aircraft wasn't cleared for any flight that day. The fuel mix wasn't calibrated, the weather wasn't ideal, and most importantly, the jet had never been tested with Hale's illegal airflow redesign and custom-forged bolts. Someone shouted for Reeves to shut the engine down. Someone else ran to fetch the commanding officer. But the whine from the compressor had already begun, higher, cleaner, stronger than anyone had ever heard from that airframe. The jet lurched forward like it had been kicked by a giant. Reeves grinned. "That's not normal," he said to no one, "and I love it." The moment the wheels left the runway, every mechanic, officer, and clerk sprinted outside. Some expected fire. Others expected the wings to shear off. A few honest men expected a funeral. But Reeves kept climbing. 5,000 feet, 10,000, 15,000. Smooth as silk. No sputtering. No compressor stall. No vibration. Up in the cockpit, Reeves felt it immediately. The engine was breathing for the first time. Hale's widened airflow channels removed the choking pressure buildup that had plagued the prototype for months. The jets on the German Me-262 had the same flaw when mishandled, airflow collapse at high throttle. But not this machine. Not today. Reeves pushed the throttle forward. The needle hit a speed the engineers had only written in theory. Down on the ground, the viewing instruments almost broke. "His airspeed indicator must be malfunctioning. That can't be right," one tech said. But it was right. Hale's forged bolts were holding the compressor under stress the factory parts never could. The scrap aluminum channels were funneling air like precision aerospace components. Then Reeves made the move that turned a test flight into legend. He dove. He didn't need to. There was no combat, no enemy, no reason at all, except curiosity. He wanted to see what Hale's outlaw engine could really do. The jet screamed downward, compressing air so violently that the chase plane lost visual instantly. Reeves felt the buffeting, the onset of compressibility, the edge of a barrier no Allied fighter had crossed. And then, smoothness, silence, a glide that felt unnatural. He wasn't fighting the air anymore. He was slipping through it. Reeves leveled out miles farther than intended, heart pounding. He whispered into the radio, "Tell Hale he's not a mechanic. He's a damn prophet." When he finally landed, half the base ran to the jet. Some expected damage, cracks. The next morning, before the base had even shaken off the cold, metal-scented fog, Captain Hale stormed into the maintenance hangar, half expecting to catch Boyd asleep under a wing like usual. Instead, he froze. The P-51 prototype, yesterday's limping, overheating embarrassment, was stripped open like an autopsy. Panels removed, coolant lines pulled, supercharger ducts dangling like exposed ribs, and Boyd, shirt half-tucked, eyes wild from no sleep, stood on top of the engine mount with a grease pencil, tracing lines that made no sense to anyone but him. Hale barked, "What in God's name are you doing?" Boyd didn't look up. "Rewriting bad math." On the floor lay sheets of paper covered in sketches, circles, airflow maps, pressure gradients, strange modular ducts shaped like nothing in the Army Air Force's manuals. One diagram looked like it belonged in a wind tunnel lab, not in a frontline hangar next to a pot of burned coffee. Hale stepped closer and picked up a page. "This isn't P-51 documentation." "No," Boyd replied, still scribbling. "It's what the documentation should have been." And then the captain saw it. One blueprint sketched so precisely, it looked like it came off North American aviation's drafting tables. But it didn't. Because in the bottom corner, in Boyd's quick, looping handwriting, were the words, "Revision 0. Fix before Washington notices." Hale nearly dropped it. "You designed an entirely new induction system overnight?" "No," Boyd said, finally hopping down. "I've been designing it for years. Just nobody ever let me test it." That was the moment Hale realized something terrifying. The mechanic he thought was just a stubborn genius was operating 10 years ahead of the U.S. military. And because of him, the Luftwaffe had no idea what was coming. The idea that shouldn't exist. Boyd explained it with the calm tone of a man who had solved a puzzle long before anyone else realized it existed. The problem: the P-51's Merlin engine lost massive efficiency at high altitude when its intercooler ducts hit pressure imbalance. It meant power drop-offs at 28,000 feet, exactly where German jets prowled. The Air Force accepted this as fact. Boyd didn't. He used a coffee tin and a busted carburetor valve as props. "Air wants symmetry," he said. "But we force it into chaos. Fix the symmetry, fix the chaos." Hale squinted. "In English." Boyd smirked. "Let the engine breathe like a bird instead of choking like a mule." His design rerouted the airflow through a dual-channel spiral duct, something no Allied engineer had even theorized yet. It would stabilize the supercharger, reduce compressor stall, and boost top-end power by nearly 18% above 30,000 feet. That meant one thing: a piston fighter that could chase a jet, which was insane, impossible, and completely illegal to attempt without Washington's approval. But Boyd wasn't waiting for Washington. The secret test no one asked for. Boyd spread out test data scribbled on dirty napkins, ammo box lids, even a torn deck of cards. Numbers, symbols, flow measurements calculated by sticking his face in the slipstream like a lunatic. Hale stared at them as if they were witchcraft. "This is..." This is classified level work. You don't have clearance for half the equations you're using. Boyd shrugged. Didn't ask for clearance. He flipped the engine master switch. The prototype shuddered. Wires smoked. Sparks jumped. And then, a sound engineers had only dreamed of. A perfectly balanced whine. A smooth, predatory hum. Not the uneven growl of a merlin, but something tighter, meaner, hungrier. Hale grabbed the rail. Jesus Christ, what did you do to my airplane? Made it honest. Boyd leaned close to the spinner as the new airflow spiral took shape inside the ducts. Smooth pressure. No surges. No choking. Just raw, uninterrupted intake. It wasn't a P-51 anymore. It was something else. Something from a future war. And no one outside this hangar was allowed to know. The first proof. Boyd pointed to the left wing. Yesterday you hit 425 mph before it shuddered. Hale nodded. And nearly ripped itself apart. Try 450 today. Hale laughed. We're not cleared for engine tests, not even ground spin-ups. Good thing we aren't asking permission. Boyd slid on his goggles. Hale froze. You're flying it? It's my blueprint. If it explodes, I want front row seats. The hangar doors creaked open. Wind roared in. Boyd taxied out. And for a moment, Hale saw something in his posture. Something dangerous. This wasn't a mechanic. This was an inventor standing at the edge of history. The wheels left the ground. The P-51 prototype surged upward with a smoothness no Mustang had ever shown. Then Boyd fired a flare. The agreed signal. The test had begun. The result. No one believed. Minutes later, the tower received a trembling transmission. Prototype is holding, repeat, holding stability at 31,000 feet. Hale nearly fell out of his chair. No Mustang held stable that high. Then the impossible. Throttle pushed past safe stop. Engine still climbing. Hitting full boost at 32,400 feet. And accelerating. Engineers ran to the consoles. The colonel overseeing the base adjusted his headset, and Boyd's voice came again. Gentlemen, Germany's jets just lost the sky. No one spoke, because they all realized something sickeningly clear. This wasn't a modification. This was a decade-ahead prototype hidden inside a standard airframe. And the mechanic who built it had just shattered the limits the entire U.S. Army Air Forces believed were unbreakable. Smoke was still drifting from the test consoles when Boyd rolled the prototype Mustang back toward the hangar. The engine purred with a confidence that didn't belong in 1944, and the ground crew stared like they were watching a ghost taxi across the runway. Hale stood frozen, headset dangling, unable to process the numbers he'd just heard through the radio. When Boyd shut down the engine and climbed out, he wore the grin of a man who had just stolen fire from the gods. You saw the numbers? He asked. Hale didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone on base had heard the climb rate, the power retention, the impossible stability at altitude. This wasn't a tune-up. It was sacrilege. And the Air Force hated sacrilege more than it hated the enemy. 2 days later, a jeep crawled across the runway carrying 3 men in crisp uniforms and expressions carved from stone. Everyone recognized the type. Air Technical Service Command, the men who approved or buried every idea the nation flew on. The lead officer didn't even introduce himself. He flashed a folder with Boyd's name on it and asked, "Where's the mechanic?" Boyd stepped forward, wiping grease from his hands. "Morning, gentlemen," one officer snapped back. "It won't stay morning for you if your report is accurate." Hale tried to defend him. "Sir, whatever he did, it worked." But the officer cut him off. "That's exactly the problem." To Washington, anything that worked too well without permission wasn't innovation. It was destabilization. They marched Boyd into a briefing room and slammed his sketches across the table. "What is this?" one demanded. "Airflow maps," Boyd answered. "Where did you get these equations?" Made them. Impossible. These are classified engineering models. Guess you shouldn't have left the textbooks unlocked. The room fell dead silent. Another officer leaned forward. Do you understand what you've done? Made an engine breathe better. No. You bypassed approval chains, used unauthorized materials, rewired Army property, and flew a prototype without clearance. You violated at least 12 regulations. Boyd shrugged. 13, if you count the flare gun. They didn't laugh. To them, he wasn't a mechanic. He was a liability. Then the highest-ranking officer finally admitted what none of them wanted to say aloud. The Mustang's value is reliability, predictability. Your modification changes its entire profile. If a single mechanic can do this in a hangar, the certification process collapses. Boyd stared. So the problem isn't that it ran too well. The problem is that I wasn't supposed to make it run well. Exactly. The Air Force wasn't afraid of Boyd's engine. They were afraid of losing control. War loved order, and Boyd was chaos wrapped in a wrench. A week later, Washington's inspectors ran their own controlled tests. Hale received the sealed report and felt his stomach twist. The data was undeniable. A 17.4% climb rate increase above 29,000 feet. Engine temperatures holding 11 degrees cooler than factory limits. Intercooler pressure almost perfectly stable. Boost power retained 3,000 feet higher than any standard Mustang. This wasn't a trick. This was a breakthrough. And the last page confirmed Hale's worst fear. Recommendation. Designed to be suppressed until further notice. Do not distribute. Field units are prohibited from replication. They weren't going to develop it. They were going to bury it. When Hale found Boyd that night, hammering out a dent on a wing, he told him, "They're locking the design up." Boyd didn't even look up. Figures? No, you don't understand. They classified it. You're not allowed to touch it again. Boyd smirked. Then they better lock up every wrench on this base. The next morning, guards arrived with orders. Boyd was barred from working on high-performance engines. The prototype was to be sealed and shipped, all copies of the data destroyed. All personnel warned that repeating the modification was forbidden. It was the closest Washington could get to erasing a man without court-martialing him. But as they escorted him away, Boyd turned back, tapped his temple, and said, "You can lock up paper, Cap. You can't lock up memory." Hale realized then that they hadn't stopped a mechanic. They had created a ghost, a man freed from oversight, working only from what he remembered and what he could build with his own hands. That made him far more dangerous and far more valuable. Later that night, Hale opened his locker and froze. Inside, wrapped in an oil-stained rag, was a single sheet of Boyd's sketches. The airflow spiral, the dual-channel duct, the impossible curves Washington wanted, erased. No note, no explanation, just the blueprint that changed everything, and proof that Boyd wasn't done. He had simply gone underground, and the war had just gained a new weapon, one the U.S. didn't authorize, didn't understand, and absolutely could not control. For 2 weeks after Washington shut him down, Boyd vanished from the hangar like a ghost who had slipped through a crack in the war. Hale saw him only in glimpses, crossing the airstrip at dawn, scribbling diagrams on scrap cardboard, scavenging metal from wrecked airframes. Officially, he'd been reassigned to non-critical duties. Unofficially, everyone knew that meant keep him away from engines before he rewrites the war again. Pilots grumbled, NCOs shook their heads, officers pretended the problem was solved. But Hale knew better. Boyd didn't quit. He simmered. Every man on base felt tension crawling through the air like static before a lightning strike. Then, on a gray morning soaked in low fog, the ghost returned. A frantic radio call broke across the air. A patrol of Mustangs had run into a high-altitude Messerschmitt strike group. New model 109Ks flying higher and faster than expected. 2 American fighters had already gone down. A third was crippled, and the Germans were still climbing. The squadron scrambled, but every available Mustang was either already in the air or grounded for repair. Every Mustang except one, the prototype, the forbidden one, the sealed one. The one wearing Boyd's fingerprints in every bolt and curve. Hale sprinted to its hangar and found the lock broken. Clean, precise, no brute force. Inside, Boyd was already climbing into the cockpit, flight suit half-zipped, eyes burning with a kind of reckless clarity Hale had never seen before. Hale froze. "You can't." Boyd flipped switches like a man born with wings. "If I don't, they die. Washington will bury you. Washington doesn't have to know." Hale swallowed. "The system's untested at combat altitude." Boyd smiled. "That's why I'm the test." Before Hale could protest, Boyd slammed the canopy shut and fired the engine. The prototype roared to life with a smooth, predatory growl, deeper, cleaner, more alive than any Mustang Hale had ever heard. It wasn't a machine. It was an animal let out of its cage. The guards arrived too late. Boyd taxied straight past them. Someone yelled. Someone else tried to block the runway with a jeep. Boyd jerked the throttle, the modified fuel mix detonated in a clean surge, and the Mustang leapt forward like a wounded comet. The jeep skidded aside at the last second. Officers screamed orders. The prototype ignored them all and launched into the sky in a climb so brutal Hale felt the hangar tremble. Up in the clouds, the battle was already spiraling into chaos. German 109s dove and climbed in knife-edge angles, picking off the American formation. A crippled Mustang was dropping fast, smoke pouring from its cowling. Its pilot's radio was barely audible. "I can't hold altitude. Somebody, anybody, help." Then a new voice cut in, steady and cold. "Hang on, kid. Help's coming." The Germans saw the intruder immediately. One of them radioed a warning that Allied interceptors shouldn't be able to reach that height so quickly. Another insisted it must be a jet. But Boyd wasn't climbing. He was rocketing, straight through their altitude band, contrails spiraling behind him like white scars across the sky. His first pass was a blur. He lined up a 109 that hadn't even rolled out of its climb yet and stitched it open with a burst so fast the German never saw him. The second enemy broke left. Boyd twisted the prototype into a tight arc no standard Mustang could physically achieve. Even Hale, listening from the ground, sucked in a breath. The prototype held structural stability deep past the red line. Boyd chased the fleeing 109 through its own exhaust plume and shredded it before it could dive. The radio went silent for a moment. Then one of the American pilots whispered, "What the hell is that Mustang made of?" Boyd didn't answer. He just kept hunting. 4 Germans fell in 90 seconds. A fifth tried to climb away, but Boyd fired the experimental boost injectors, his own forbidden design, and the prototype vaulted upward as if the sky itself were pushing it. The Germans broke formation in panic. The crippled Mustang regained level flight. The squadron leader, stunned, finally radioed, "Whoever's in that Mustang, stay with us. We're reforming around you." The ghost had returned, and the Luftwaffe felt it. Back on the ground, Hale stood alone on the runway, staring at the contrails carving impossible lines across the heavens. He knew what this meant. Boyd had just flown proof that Washington could no longer bury. Data had spoken louder than regulations. A single mechanic had rewritten aviation physics with scrap metal instinct and disobedience. And somewhere above the clouds, the war had just shifted. The prototype limped back to base, trailing heat shimmer instead of smoke, a sign of an engine pushed beyond anything the designers ever imagined. When Boyd rolled to a stop, the engine coughed once, twice, then settled into a soft metallic ticking as it cooled. It wasn't the sound of a machine dying. It was the sound of a machine catching its breath after outrunning physics itself. Hale was the first to reach the aircraft. He pressed a hand to the cowling and felt the impossible. The engine temperature was lower than it should have been after such abuse. The airflow redesign had kept the heat distribution even, and the forbidden fuel mix hadn't detonated. The burn had been clean, controlled, and in perfect sync with the custom bolts he'd forged. Washington's engineers said this engine couldn't survive 5 minutes at those settings. Boyd had just forced it through 40. Inside the briefing room, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Officers demanded explanations, pilots demanded answers, mechanics demanded to know how the hell the prototype didn't shake itself apart. Hale tried to break down the physics in plain language for the brass, explaining that Boyd's modifications weren't random tinkering, they were a full harmonic recalibration. The bolt geometry he'd invented stabilized micro-vibrations in the compressor, letting the blades bite air at steeper angles without oscillating. No oscillation meant no blade fatigue. No fatigue meant the compressor could overspin safely. And overspin is where speed lives. The officers sat stiff, arms folded, refusing to acknowledge the truth. What Boyd had accomplished wasn't unauthorized maintenance. It was engineering evolution performed with scrap metal, intuition, and field tools. But the true miracle wasn't the overspin. It was the airflow rewrite. Boyd had reshaped the compressor inlets using hand-filed aluminum panels. No blueprints, no factory tools. Just his instinct for how air wanted to move if you stopped forcing it through bureaucratic geometry. Traditional design made the compressor fight turbulence. Boyd's design guided the turbulence into alignment. Result: 12 to 15% more mass airflow at altitude, and a cooler burn that kept detonation thresholds stable even in thin air. In other words, the engine wasn't choking anymore. It was breathing the way it always should have. Then Hale dropped the final bombshell. This engine isn't just better. It's 10 years ahead of current U.S. jet research. The room froze. The officers exchanged looks, not of disbelief, but something closer to fear. If word of this breakthrough spread, it would make half the ongoing Air Force development programs obsolete. Funding pipelines would be threatened. Careers would be upended. And worse, it would prove that genius didn't live in Washington's labs. It lived in a mechanic's hands. One of the officers finally snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done? If these modifications reach the front, there will be no quality control, no consistency, no oversight." Hale pushed back hard. "Sir, with respect, consistency doesn't win wars. Performance does." The officer replied quietly, "Performance without obedience destroys command. And command is how nations survive." The argument crystallized the truth. This wasn't about engineering. It was about control. Boyd's creation was too effective, too unpredictable, and too far outside the chain of authority. It couldn't be allowed to exist. Yet they couldn't deny the combat report either. 5 kills, 0 mechanical failures, a crippled Mustang saved, a German attack disrupted. Every witness confirmed the same thing. The prototype climbed faster than any P-51 on record and maneuvered with stability no piston engine should have possessed. Hale knew what was coming. The brass would bury the experiment again. But this time, something was different. The pilots had seen the truth. They'd watched the impossible unfold above the clouds, and they weren't going to let it vanish behind classified doors. As the meeting devolved into shouting, a messenger entered with urgent radar data. German reconnaissance flights had been detected probing higher altitudes, testing new attack profiles. The officers paused, suddenly aware that the Luftwaffe was evolving, adapting, and hunting for weaknesses. Hale looked at Boyd and understood the unspoken message. The war was changing faster than the rulebook could keep up, and the only engine fast enough to face what was coming was the one Washington wanted destroyed. The first warning didn't come from radar. It came from the ground, a faint tremor under the sandbags like distant thunder. Hale stepped outside the hangar into a moonlit haze and felt the vibration again, this time stronger. It wasn't weather. It was engines, powerful ones, fast ones, and far too many. A second later, the air raid sirens screamed across the base. Spotlights carved white spears through the darkness. Officers sprinted from tents. Mechanics dove for cover. Pilots ran for their aircraft. Above them, a formation of German bombers and high-altitude fighters slipped through the night like steel sharks moving through black water. The Luftwaffe wasn't scouting anymore. They were attacking. The first explosions hit the far end of the runway, shaking the hangars and showering the ground with debris. Bf-110 night fighters hunted the perimeter, their engines snarling through the sky as they searched for parked aircraft to rip apart. One bomb fell close enough to blow Hale onto his back, ears ringing. When he staggered up, he saw something even worse. Half the squadron's Mustangs were pinned between burning fuel trucks. The other half were grounded with mechanical issues. German timing had been perfect. They'd hit the base at its weakest moment. Hale looked toward the sealed hangar where the prototype sat under guard and felt a cold realization crawl down his spine. The officers reached the same conclusion a moment later. In the command tent, panic rippled through the room. The anti-air guns were outmatched. The fighters were outnumbered. The runway was half cratered. And in less than 3 minutes, the Germans would be making a second pass. Lower, more accurate, and lethal. The base commander shouted, "Scramble anything that can fly!" But the truth slammed into the room like another explosion. Nothing could. Nothing except the forbidden plane. Hale sprinted out before anyone could stop him. The prototype sat in the shadows, guarded by 2 military police. Their rifles were up as he approached. "Stand back," one ordered. Hale didn't slow. "You don't understand. If that thing stays grounded, we lose the whole base." The MPs shook their heads. "Orders are strict. No one gets in or out." Hale pointed upward as tracer fire streaked across the clouds. "Tell that to them." A low-flying German bomber roared overhead, dropping a string of bombs that marched toward the fuel depot. The guards hesitated for a single heartbeat, and that was enough. A Mustang engine screamed to life behind them. Hale jerked around and saw Boyd in motion, sprinting toward the sealed hangar from the other side of the airfield. He must have been watching the sky since the first explosion. Before the MPs could regroup, Boyd vaulted over a sandbag wall, snatched a wrench someone had dropped by, and smashed the chain on the hangar door in 3 brutal strikes. "Open it!" he yelled. Hale rushed to help. Together they shoved the heavy doors back, revealing the prototype like a sleeping beast waiting for its cue. Another explosion tore across the tarmac as Boyd climbed into the cockpit. The MPs tried to stop him, shouting warnings, but the roar of the engines swallowed their voices. The prototype's modified system didn't cough or sputter. It awakened with the same predatory growl it had shown weeks earlier, the sound of a machine built not by committees, but by instinct. Hale slapped the canopy shut. "You're going up alone," Boyd smirked. "Then I'll make it crowded real fast." He taxied onto a runway full of smoking craters and burning wreckage. Flames lit the underside of the Mustang like molten gold. German fighters buzzed overhead, confident the Americans were grounded. Boyd pushed the throttle forward, the forbidden fuel mix igniting with a surge that no factory Mustang could match. The aircraft lunged down the broken strip, bounced once over rubble, then tore itself into the sky like a rocket ripping free of gravity. Up above, the Luftwaffe's second attack wave rolled in. The Germans believed they had the advantage. They believed the base was finished. They believed nothing could reach their altitude, their speed, or their timing. They didn't know the ghost had risen again. And this time, he was hunting them. Boyd burst through the cloud deck into a sky already torn apart by muzzle flashes and flaming debris. The Luftwaffe's second wave, 4 bombers and a screen of high-altitude fighters, was lining up to hammer the base into ash. They expected panic. They expected chaos. They expected helpless Americans scrambling on the ground. What they did not expect was a lone Mustang climbing toward them faster than any Allied piston fighter on Earth had ever moved. The German formation spotted him almost immediately. One of the fighter escorts, a Bf-109G, top of its class, bristling with cannon fire, broke formation to intercept. The pilot radioed calmly to his squadron. "Single American fighter approaching. He will not reach us." Boyd rolled the prototype onto its side and punched the throttle. The forbidden airflow redesign fed the engine a perfect stream. The banned fuel mix ignited in a blistering surge, and the Mustang did something 109 pilots were not trained to expect. It accelerated in the climb. The German pilot froze. His instincts told him the angle was wrong, the speed impossible. The physics broken. Boyd didn't give him time to recalculate. He snapped the Mustang into a high-angle firing pass and shredded the 109's fuselage before the German could even roll out of the maneuver. The explosion lit the clouds orange. The German radio channel erupted in alarm. Two more fighters peeled off to intercept, cutting across Boyd's path from both sides. They expected a turning fight, a game of angles and patience. Instead, Boyd lit the experimental injectors, forcing the prototype into a brutal vertical snap that would have stalled any factory Mustang. The airflow stayed coherent, the engine stayed cool, the wings held. He shot straight upward like a man climbing a ladder into the sun. The German fighters overshot beneath him, confused, unable to match the maneuver. Boyd inverted, dropped behind them, and sent the first one spiraling earthward in a plume of burning fuel. The second enemy pilot panicked and dove toward the bombers for protection. Boyd followed, but not in a traditional dive. He pushed the nose down at an angle that mechanics swore would rip the propeller from the engine mount. The prototype didn't flinch. The Germans had no counter for something that broke the rules they thought were unbreakable. Down below, Hale stood on the runway, staring up at the sky, transformed into a hellish light show. Every burst of tracer fire seemed impossibly high. Every explosion felt like divine retribution. Officers around him were shouting orders he barely registered. All Hale could think was, "This is the future they tried to bury." Meanwhile, the bomber formation reached its attack point. 4 He-111s locked onto the base below. Their bombs primed for release. Their gunners spotted Boyd closing in and opened fire, turning the air ahead of him into a net of glowing tracers. A normal Mustang would have backed off. A normal engine would have overheated. But Boyd didn't have a normal engine. He held his line, threading through the fire as the guns stitched the air around him. At the last possible second, he rolled inverted and fired a 2-second burst across the lead bomber's cockpit. The canopy shattered. The bomber dropped out of formation like a kite with a cut string. The remaining 3 scattered, their carefully timed attack collapsing into panic. The formation commander shouted in German, "What fighter climbs like this? What fighter moves like this?" No one answered. They didn't have a name for what Boyd was flying. Boyd lined up his next victim, a bomber trying to turn back toward the coast. He squeezed the trigger, felt the airframe tremble under the recoil, and watched the bomber erupt into fire. A second fell seconds later. The fourth fled at full throttle, dumping bombs in the ocean just to lighten the load. In the span of 90 seconds, Boyd had dismantled an entire Luftwaffe strike group. Back on the ground, the base commander whispered, "One plane did all that?" Hale didn't take his eyes off the sky. "No," he said quietly. "One mechanic did." The sky fell silent. No more bombers. No more fighters, no more German presence. Just a lone prototype Mustang circling above the smoking base, victorious, untouchable, and carrying the truth Washington would never be able to hide again. Boyd didn't just sweep the Luftwaffe aside. He changed the war. The next morning, the prototype sat under a canvas tarp, still warm from the mission that had saved the base. Mechanics walked around it in a daze, whispering like they were standing in front of a sacred relic. But while the enlisted men celebrated, the officers looked nervous. Too many questions. Too much noise on the radio channels. Too much evidence. By noon, a pair of olive-drab sedans rolled onto the airfield. The doors opened, and out stepped 2 men in perfectly pressed uniforms with no unit patches and expressions that said they had already made up their minds. Washington had arrived. Not to congratulate Boyd or commend Hale, but to bury the entire operation before anyone else found out. They summoned Boyd into a makeshift courtroom inside a supply hangar. A single table. 3 officers behind it. A transcript clerk already typing. No applause, no gratitude, just cold procedure. The lead colonel didn't even look up from his file when Boyd sat down. "Captain Joseph Boyd," he began, voice flat. "You stand accused of unauthorized flight operations, reckless endangerment of military property, experimental modification of classified hardware, and violating direct orders pertaining to prototype testing protocols." Boyd stared at him, jaw clenched. "Sir, with respect, there'd be nothing left of this airfield without that mission." "That," the colonel replied, "is irrelevant to the charges." Hale burst into the room before anyone could stop him. "Irrelevant! He shot down half a Luftwaffe strike group by himself." His voice echoed off the hangar beams. "You weren't here. You didn't see what that engine did." The panel exchanged irritated glances. Washington hated interruptions even more than it hated unapproved brilliance. The second officer leaned forward. "Sergeant Hale, this is not your hearing." "No," Hale fired back, "but it is my engine." Every head turned. Hale realized too late he'd just admitted the forbidden modifications in front of the tribunal. The lead colonel closed the file slowly, savoring the moment. "Ah, so you are the origin of these adjustments." Hale swallowed. "I am, sir." "Then you will receive your own charges shortly." The clerk's typewriter clacked faster. But before the colonel could continue, an unexpected voice spoke from the back of the room. "That won't be necessary." All eyes turned. A brigadier general, an inspector from the Pentagon, stepped forward. His presence alone shifted the air, as if the entire hangar straightened its posture. He held a thin folder, already knowing the weight of what was inside. "I've reviewed the air-to-air combat reports," the general said. "I've spoken with radar operators who witnessed the engagement. I've seen the gun camera footage." He paused. "You can't court-martial results like that." The tribunal bristled. The lead colonel snapped. "With respect, General, this pilot violated—" "He violated the enemy's entire battle plan," the general interrupted. "And that's the only violation that matters to me." For the first time that day, Boyd's expression cracked into something like disbelief. Hale blinked at the man, unsure if this was salvation or another trap. The general laid the folder on the table. "Gentlemen, this is bigger than your regulations. The Germans now know a single American fighter tore apart one of their most advanced strike groups. If this breaks containment, they will dedicate their entire intelligence corps to finding out how." His voice dropped. "And if they find out what this prototype can really do, we lose our strategic advantage, and maybe the war's timetable along with it." Silence filled the hangar. Even the typewriter stopped. "So here are your orders," the general continued. "The pilot will not be court-martialed. The mechanic will not be reprimanded. Instead, both will be reassigned to a classified program immediately." Boyd asked, "What program, sir?" The general met his eyes. "The one that decides the future of American air power." The tribunal had no choice. The colonel closed his folder with visible frustration. The charges were dropped. The hearing dissolved like smoke. But the victory didn't feel like freedom. It felt like recruitment. Boyd and Hale weren't being punished. They were being drafted into something far more dangerous. That night, long after the tribunal had scattered and the base settled into an uneasy quiet, a military courier arrived with a sealed crate addressed only to Captain Boyd and Sergeant Hale, eyes only. No insignias, no paperwork, no explanation. Just thick steel locks and the kind of silence that meant somebody wanted this opened, but never discussed. Boyd pried the lid loose. Inside was a single binder, wrapped in oilcloth and stamped with a classification level neither of them had ever seen. Hale lifted it carefully, like it was radioactive. On the cover, stenciled in fading ink, Project Revenant, Engine Series X-13, Field Notes, Failed Tests, and Discarded Parameters. Hale froze. "Failed tests? Sir, this is the engine we were never supposed to use." He flipped it open, and instantly understood why Washington wanted it gone. The pages weren't official schematics, they were scribbles, margins filled with handwritten corrections, equations scratched out violently and replaced with unorthodox ratios and impossible airflow tolerances. It wasn't a manual. It was a diary. A diary written by an engineer who had disappeared from government records a decade earlier. Boyd leaned over Hale's shoulder as they read the first entry. The X-13 isn't flawed. It's misunderstood. If they'd let me test my own adjustments, it would run hotter, cleaner, and faster than anything we've built. But they're afraid. Afraid of what it could do. Afraid of what it would prove. The next page. If the military shelves this engine, I'm taking my notes with me. Better they bury my name than bury the truth. Hale whispered, "Sir, this is everything I stumbled into. The ratios, the fuel pressure, the airflow channeling. I reinvented what this guy already knew." Boyd nodded, and Washington tried to erase him. They turned more pages. Each one peeled back another layer of the forbidden brilliance. Experimental fuel mixes, combustion angles that violated every wartime regulation, cooling solutions that looked like a madman's sketches, but matched the behavior of the prototype perfectly. All of it labeled rejected or unauthorized. Then came the page that made both men stop cold. A blueprint, crude but unmistakable, showing a variant of the X-13 engine capable of sustained output beyond anything the U.S. military had acknowledged even existed. Next to it, scribbled in the margin, "This engine will break the next war before it starts." Hale stared at it. "Sir, do you know what this means?" Boyd exhaled slowly. "It means the engine we flew today isn't the final version. It's the prototype of a prototype." And then Hale said the words that hung in the air like prophecy. "Sir, this could change everything." But the final entry told a darker truth. If you're reading this, they've decided to use the engine after all. They'll claim it was their idea. They'll bury my name. They'll bury the danger. And they'll bury you too, if you don't keep quiet. Boyd closed the binder. The room felt suddenly smaller. The generator hum outside sounded like an approaching storm. "Sergeant," he said, "we're not dealing with a secret project." Hale met his eyes. "We're dealing with a ghost." Boyd nodded. "A ghost who built the future and got erased for it." A knock hit the door. An officer stood there, crisp uniform, expression unreadable. "You too," he said. "The general wants you wheels up in Euro 400. New assignment, new location. No bags, no goodbyes." Hale glanced at Boyd. "Sir, what now?" Boyd lifted the binder, slid it back into the crate, and latched the lid. "We follow orders," he said, "and we find out why the future was buried."